All right. Well, I'm back, and we're going to talk in this segment about structuralism and some other, beginnings before cognitive psychology was founded. So, if you've taken introductory psychology, you've probably heard the term structuralism. Structuralism was a school of thought that focused on the nature of sensations. So, if you watched my last video, you heard me talking about the importance for the British empiricists of, making associations among our sensations. Sensation is an important word in the pre cognitive psychology world of understanding what was going on inside the mind. In structuralism, the nature of sensations was referring to the idea that the structuralists were trying to figure out how exactly the world is represented in our minds, right? So, like, if you see something, what different details are represented in your mind so that your brain can kind of see that object inside of itself. Like, how does the brain do that? So they were trying to figure out the nature of the sensations. They were really trying to analyze the basic elements of consciousness. So they would set up little experiments where, for example, one of my favorite ones is when they would have the participants sit in a completely dark room, and then they would maybe have a candle in the room, and the person was supposed to explain exactly what their sensations were. And they were supposed to explain everything: what it looked like, what it smelled like, could they feel the heat from it. They were supposed to explain everything. But my favorite one was where they snuck up on the poor unsuspecting participant and stabbed him with a pin. And they wanted the participant to explain exactly what that felt like. Like, exactly what was your conscious experience of being stabbed by that pin? And so they should be describing, pain. They should be expressing maybe some anger or fear. I mean, a whole bunch of different things that would go into their experience of that sensation, right? And it's not just the pain part, the physical part. It's also, maybe did they see anything? Did they hear anything? Did they, all the different senses, as well as any maybe conscious associations that they made. Wundt was the researcher who came up with this strategy for studying sensations and consciousness. It was named by his student Titchener, Structuralism. Titchener was the one who came up with the idea of calling it Structuralism, saying that what we were interested in is the structure of consciousness. And so it was Wundt's follower who actually named it. Now, if you've studied psychology at all, you are aware that a lot of people attribute the founding of psychology as a field to Wilhelm Wundt, who was studying structuralism in Leipzig, Germany, back in the very late 1800s. And so this is still, of course, before cognitive psychology, but you can see that the very beginning of psychology was this interest in things that were going on inside the mind, things that were not directly observable. And that's really important to remember as we're going along. Now, the methodology that Wundt used was a technique called introspection. So he trained subjects to participate in his studies. These were not just, in modern psychological research, we tend to recruit, undergraduates who are enrolled in a Psych 100 class to come participate in our research. And they usually come in completely naive. We don't want them to know what's going on. That's not how it was for Wundt's participants. He actually trained them very thoroughly and taught them how to look, he would give them certain experiences and then he would cue them. Now think about, how did that taste? How did that smell? What did it look like? He really trained them to think about things in a way that our natural tendency doesn't do. A lot of times in our natural tendencies, we gloss over a lot of the more nuanced little experiences that we're having. And so he had to train them very thoroughly to be able to explain their experience. He put them into a very stimulus-free environment. He had a soundproof lab with, he could make it completely dark if he wanted to, or he could have it be lighted. He could do whatever he wanted to make sure that they had only the experiences that he wanted them to. So the subject's job was to describe their sensations. The results are considered very unreliable and generally invalid in that, because we were relying so heavily on the participants' ability to explain their mental states, we have no knowledge, no way of knowing what exactly they were experiencing, right? I mean, there's no way to look inside their head and confirm that they were having the experience that they're describing. And so, structuralism ended up falling out of favor because it was so imprecise. And it's kind of unfortunate because the subject matter fell out of favor with structuralism. And so we didn't have a return to these kinds of basic experience kinds of questions, these things, mental processes that were going on inside the participants' minds. We didn't have a return to this for another almost 100 years. So that's kind of unfortunate that because of the technique, we had to abandon the topic. Structuralism was basically replaced by a field called functionalism. So if structuralism was founded in the 1880s, functionalism came around about 30 years later, when a bunch of different American students who were all studying philosophy degrees with this emphasis on psychological questions had gone and studied with Wilhelm Wundt in his lab. And after studying in Wundt's lab, they walked away with a different question than the one being asked in Wundt's lab. They started to show an interest in the function of conscious capabilities. Like, why do we have the ability to speak? Why do we have the kind of memory that we do? Like, why do we have these? What's the function? What does it do for us? And you can imagine that functionalism came out about, a couple decades after Darwin introduced the idea of evolution with the publication of On the Origin of Species. So functionalism is very much influenced by evolutionary principles. It was very associationistic. They were very much interested in the process of conscious capabilities rather than the content. So instead of asking participants about their experience with this sensation or that sensation, instead they were trying to figure out ways to see how they were processing the information. So they had to get kind of clever. They started to show a focus on observable behavior. They were doing a lot of animal studies. A lot of modern psychology students, myself included, and I'd say anybody, after 1960 probably would be considered a more modern psychology student, in the sense that a lot of us have asked, why were there so many animal studies back in the olden days? Like, what was it with the animals? And what it was with the animals is that they believed that that animals were like a simpler model of humans. That in fact, the fact that humans have this big cerebral cortex that causes them to think all of these complex thoughts and try and figure out what the study's about, and have some self-consciousness about how they might be appearing to the researcher, and all this stuff muddies the actual process of what they're doing. And so if we could get rid of all that self-consciousness and self-awareness and all those things, then we could get a purer model of what exactly is going on. So they go, well, animals don't seem very self-conscious. Animals don't seem to be too concerned about what the real purpose of the study is. Why don't we just use animals and see if we can get a basic model for at least the lower level versions of things that the humans can do. And so as much as they could, they would use animal models because it just was, they thought, cleaner. To study humans, they introduced paper and pencil tests. And you guys are all familiar with paper and pencil tests, right? These little surveys that we can give you, and you can rate it on a scale from 1 to 7. My husband always goes, why is it 7? And I'm like, I don't know. Likert thought it would be a good number. It's odd. It gives enough range. I don't know. That's just what he thought would make sense. But I mean, you've seen these kinds of paper and pencil tests where there's sort of standardized questions, like where everybody sees the same thing. There are limited response options, so you have to pick from what's been offered. It allows us to see sort of controlled insight into people's attitudes or other conscious capabilities. And so paper and pencil test came along thanks to functionalism. So I already mentioned the study in the animals because of evolutionary theory. So the functionalist, the founding father of functionalism was William James. And so you may have heard his name before. And then there are some less famous people that, as far as, introductory psychology, we wouldn't talk about them, but that would include people like Dewey and Engel. So these are turn of the 1900s century psychologists who were attempting to come up with ways to measure mental processes in a way that would be directly observable. Like that was their intention. And then to figure out why we have these skills would be the next step. And that's the functional part, the functionalism part. Now, behaviorism came on the scene around 1920. And behaviorism reigned in psychology. It was king for the next 50 years, really. And so behaviorism came along and declared that psychology must confine itself to observable variables. And those variables were called stimuli and then responses. We should not talk, according to behaviorism, about anything that's going on inside what they called the black box of the brain. That if we attempt to explain what's going on inside the subject's head or the participant's head, we are weakening psychology as a field because we cannot know what's going on inside their head. So all we know is that a stimulus was provided and then the subject produced a response. That's all we can say. This area of psychology used to be called SR psychology, stimulus response psychology. And SR psychology was king, like I said, for a good 50 years. Really, you could not publish anything that wasn't SR psychology. The idea is that you've got some kind of event, and they called that a stimulus. A little later on into behaviorism, they started to call it a predictor. But you've got some kind of event, and it leads to behavior, and that is what they called the response. The behavior might be a verbal response. You might say yes, no, or you might, say agree, disagree, or whatever. Or it might be a flinch or an eye blink or a shiver, depending on what kind of model we were testing at the time. So, got a little animation going on. Oh, that is some high quality animation where it's the event led to the behavior. The assumption in behaviorism is that the event, the stimulus, leads to the response. And that we don't need to say the event leads to some thoughts inside the learner's head that then causes them to do a response. That the thoughts inside the head don't add to our ability to describe the behavior. So why would you introduce that level of uncertainty and include it in your model? That was the basic premise. Watson was the founding father of this, John Watson. He was the one who so strictly said we need to adhere to just observable variables. We have to just focus on these things. Well, there are different kinds of behaviorism. There is what we call radical behaviorism because it is radical, dude. And it says that the goal of psychology is the prediction and control of behavior. So let us sit on that for a second while we listen to my woodpecker. That's my clock. It does a different bird every hour. So let's sit on that for a second and think about the prediction. Okay, that doesn't sound too bad. And control of behavior. Kind of creepy if you think about it. And if you think about our modern life, you might look around and see some evidence that people learned from radical behaviorists that we can control people's behavior, that there are ways that we can predict and then ultimately control a person's behavior, or in animals, in the form of training and things like that. So in radical behaviorism, the job of the psychologist is to observe the environmental events and their consequent behaviors. So what happens naturally out in the environment that leads to, the behavior maybe that we want or that we don't want in our learner. And then ultimately we can attempt to control those consequent behaviors by controlling the events in the environment. This area of behaviorism was not theory driven. They really let the empirical evidence guide their theory development. And so in radical behaviorism, it was almost like an applied psychology, really. In applied psychology, the goal is to solve a current problem, right? So the research that I'm doing is because I want to find out, what the best desk design is to reduce, injuries from people who have to sit all day at a desk. That's applied psychology, where you have a purpose right now for doing this research. Radical behaviorism was kind of like that. The goal being to control behavior, right? To learn how to predict the behavior so that we can ultimately gain control over it. And so the empirical evidence was the important thing. The most famous radical behaviorist was B.F. Skinner, and he was the one who you might remember had, rats who pressed a lever in a box and they got rewarded sometimes and sometimes they didn't. He also was the one who trained pigeons the same way. And then ultimately the goal was to have them drive torpedoes in World War II to bomb, ships from other countries. And luckily we figured out to have self-guided torpedoes before any pigeons actually had to drive a torpedo. But he was able to train animals to do stuff like that because he had gotten control over the environmental events that then allowed him to control the consequent behaviors. So he referred to the environmental events as reinforcement, right? So if I reinforce a behavior, it can lead the animal or the person to learn, and that can cause them to display a relatively permanent change in their behavior. So in radical behaviorism, we're going to manage those reinforcements so that we can control behavior. And hopefully we can control behavior so that it will actually be changed into the future, even as we stop providing the reinforcement. We can maybe get this to be self-maintaining. The other kind of behaviorism is referred to as methodological behaviorism, or they may refer to it as neurobehaviorism. Neuro means, brain. So we're starting to maybe think about things going on inside the organism. So in this field, they started to acknowledge that behavior changes might be due to learning inside the organism. It's not just the presence of reinforcement, but instead maybe there is a thought going on inside the dog's head or the human's head. Oh, I think there might be a treat involved here in the case of a dog. Or, in the past I've gotten a smile from my mom for doing this, whatever. And so those thoughts inside the organism started to be recognized. Spence said that learning is an intervening variable. Hull said that learning is a hypothetical construct, but it is in fact real in the organism's mind, and that the learner could attribute characteristics to their own learning. So in our own heads, we're aware of what's going on. We realize that we've learned things, or we remember things, or that we used to behave in a different way than we are now. Like, we're aware of that. But according to Hull, it's just a hypothetical construct. For Spence, it was just an intervening variable between the stimulus and the response. So you can see over on the right-hand side, we're a little less structured in our talk about learning, and we start to have slightly disparate viewpoints on it depending on the theorist. I just pulled a couple out to give you examples, but here's the good news. The fact that methodological and neurobehaviorism are the newer parts of behaviorism, we are starting to see some chinks in the behavioristic armor, which means it's not long before we're going to start to see cognitive psychology come on the scene. So let's go ahead and take a break here. We'll come back in the next segment and talk about cognitivism and its baby, cognitive psychology.